It is 1941, and Germany and her allies are striking deep into the Soviet Union, advancing rapidly and overrunning entire Soviet armies. But in the north, on the Finnish front, there is an exception to this war of manoeuvre. An isolated Soviet base, far behind Finnish lines, accessible only by sea, and placed under siege on the very first day of the war. This base would end up as one of the last Soviet holdouts on the Baltic coast, seeing months of trench warfare and ferocious island battles. And this unusual battleground was called Hanko. By the start of the Second World War, Finland was still a relatively new country, having only gained independence from the Russian Empire in 1917, during the early days of the Russian Revolution. Having their own civil war between the Whites and the Reds, where unlike in the Soviet Union, the Whites won, partially because of help given by Imperial Germany towards the end of the Great War. This legacy of anti-communism, their close proximity to Leningrad, the USSR's second city, and their important position controlling access to the Baltic Sea, made them a prime enemy of the Soviets. Following the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact of 1939, the Soviets began taking steps to take over all of the Baltic states, with Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania being forced to agree to mutual assistance treaties, which allowed large Soviet military bases in their countries, which would later be used as a springboard to annex them the following year. The Soviets demanded that Finland agree to similar measures, but without success, ultimately leading to them attempting an invasion, starting on the 30th of November 1939, which would become infamously known as the Winter War. The Red Army suffered massive losses against the small and under-equipped Finnish Army, in large part due to the difficult terrain and incompetence at all levels of Soviet command following the rapid expansion of the Red Army and the Great Purge, though the worst failures would be rectified and they would achieve a limited victory by March of 1940, forcing Finland to cede 9% of her territory and give the Soviet Union a 30-year lease for a military base on the Hanko Peninsula. Hanko is a peninsula guarding the entrance to the Gulf of Finland, only 70 kilometres from the other side, and because of its position it has been fortified and fought over many times. The first forts were built in the 17th century by the Swedish, who ruled Finland at the time, and the Battle of Gungut between the Russian and Swedish navies was fought nearby. More forts would be built in the 19th and early 20th centuries by the Russians to further protect the approaches to St. Petersburg, though these would be abandoned around the time of the Russian Revolution. And it would be here that German forces coming to help the Whites in the Finnish Civil War would first arrive. The coastal artillery in Hanko would briefly participate in the Winter War, fending off the Soviet cruiser Kirov and 2 destroyers. With the end of the Winter War, with the signing of the Treaty of Moscow on the 12th of March 1940, much of the peninsula and many of the surrounding islands were leased to the Soviets, with only 10 days allowed for the Finns to evacuate every one, and any equipment of value, including 6 large coastal guns, which the Soviets expected to take ownership of, but were evacuated with hours to spare. Upon their arrival, the Red Army began to transform the small, vacant port town into a major military base. The Soviet garrison of Hanko by June 1941 consisted of 23,500 men, with anti-aircraft guns, field, coastal, and super-heavy artillery, as well as tanks and a fighter squadron, along with 3 patrol boats, 14 torpedo boats, and 4 submarines. The Soviets planned that in case of a war, they would use the base to form a front behind the main front lines, in order to strike at the Finnish heartland and the capital, Helsinki. As such, a considerable Finnish force was formed opposing them, with a line of fortifications, 22,000 troops, and a considerable number of artillery pieces, though mostly of positively ancient and relatively immobile types. When Finland was approached by the Germans in early 1941 regarding their possible involvement in invading the Soviet Union alongside them, Hanko was regarded as an objective of high priority, and the German 163rd Division was assigned to help the Finns retake it. However, it would be diverted to the Ladoga-Karelia front, and thus, when the time came, only a Finnish force was present. On the 22nd of June 1941, Germany invaded the Soviet Union. Later that same day, the Soviets would begin shelling the Finns from their base at Hanko, and Finland would declare war on them 3 days later, in a conflict that would become known as the Continuation War. In eastern Finland, they would soon begin advancing into their former territories lost the year before following the end of the Winter War, and in Hanko, Finnish troops would settle in for a long siege. Most of the battle on the mainland was marked by artillery battles, as the Soviets wanted to hold the strategically important port, and the Finns lacked the men and will to take the casualties required to mount an assault and actually take it. Due to the static nature of the front, the Finns would equip the so-called Hanko front with older artillery pieces, many without recoil systems, that had either been inherited from Russia in 1917-18 or had been purchased from the French in 1940. These old guns were difficult to aim, required resetting after each shot, and lacked mobility, but all of these issues were less of a problem on the relatively low intensity and static Hanko front, allowing newer and better artillery pieces to be sent to the main Karelian fronts. However, for artillery to be effective, spotting is needed to find targets, and observe the fall of shells. This is a difficult task in flat, heavily forested Finland, and so the hundreds of islands around the peninsula became vital for this purpose for both sides, in order to hit the Finnish troops for the Soviets, and for the Finns to hit Soviet troops and supply routes. More than a dozen islands we fought over during the battle, combat usually being short and deadly between relatively small groups of soldiers. The most notable of all these battles was the Battle of Bengtsja. Bengtsja is an island to the west of Hanko, and had and still has the tallest lighthouse in the Nordic countries, making it a perfect observation post for artillery against most of the potential supply routes to Hanko. The Finnish garrison of the island consisted of only 40 men, when on the 25th of July, Soviet forces aiming to destroy the lighthouse approached the island with more than 120 men on 7 boats. They would be spotted only just before they landed, and the Finns would mount a heroic defence of the lighthouse for several hours, until they, running low on ammunition and grenades, would be saved by reinforcements. Interestingly, many of the soldiers involved in the Battle of Hanko were not actually Finns, but were in fact of Swedish origin, being either Finland Swedes, that is to say from the community of Swedes in Finland descended from Swedish settlers, or volunteers from Sweden itself, who were organised into their own unit called the Swedish Volunteer Battalion. While the stalemate around Hanko continued, the rest of the Red Army was facing defeat after defeat, with the city of Tallinn across the Gulf of Finland falling to German forces on the 28th of August, the siege of Leningrad beginning on the 8th of September, followed by the capture of the Moonsund archipelago on the 22nd of October. With these events, the importance of the base at Hanko diminished greatly, and with winter looming, when sea ice would cover the Gulf of Finland, allowing the base to be flanked from the ice, and when any evacuation would be impossible, the Soviet High Command, the Stavka, decided on the 23rd of October to abandon the base and evacuate the garrison. The first half of the garrison was evacuated between the 1st and the 28th of November, in 9 separate waves, with many Soviet ships being lost, mostly to mines, while the second half would be evacuated in one go, on the night of the 2nd and 3rd of December. During this final phase of the evacuation, the repurposed Soviet passenger ship, the Joseph Stalin, nominally with a capacity of around 500 passengers, but actually packed with more than 5,500 men, would hit 3 sea mines and would take a hit from a Finnish 12-inch shore battery, sinking the ship. 1,740 would be rescued by other Soviet ships involved in the evacuation. The rest of those still alive, around 3,000, would end up being taken captive by the Germans 2 days later. 20 Soviet ships in all would be lost during the evacuation, including 3 destroyers and 4 minesweepers. On the morning of the 3rd, Finnish troops would discover the absence of their enemy and would liberate a heavily mined Hanko. Following the end of the Battle of Hanko, the Swedish Volunteer Battalion would return home to Sweden, being seen off by Marshal Mannerheim himself, and would receive a hero's welcome in Stockholm. Finnish troops would cease their offensive operations across the front only a few days later, and would dig in for a long period of trench warfare, until a Soviet offensive pushed them back in 1944, which was successfully halted for long enough to sign a separate peace with the Soviet Union. The new treaty signed with the USSR would give them further territory in the north, and would have them abandon their lease of Hanko, but would force a 50-year lease of another port, known as Porkkala, lying just 15 kilometers west of Helsinki. This base was only used by the Soviets for a few years, before being abandoned and returned to Finland in 1956. Though only minor in the context of the colossal battles of the Eastern Front, Hanko is an oddity in both its location and the nature of the fighting. It is remembered in Finland mostly for the Swedish and Swedish-speaking soldiers who fought there, while in Russia it is remembered as a successful defensive action, a rare victory of a kind amidst the catastrophic losses of that year. Thanks for watching the video, and if you've enjoyed it or found it informative, please consider liking, commenting, subscribing, or sharing it elsewhere for more like this in the future.